Hello everybody, Martin Radner here from Radner Law Group, bringing you trial analysis. Today we're going to be discussing Alexandra Bucalo, I believe that's how you say her name, her first move as the new prosecutor in the Melly case. So her first move, at least that we all can see, is she filed a motion in the Melly case. So what was her motion? So the title of her motion, which was filed October 20th, 2023 at 10:35 a.m., says, state's motion for admissibility of consciousness of guilt evidence and request for ruling prior to jury being sworn. So, what is this motion about? Let's jump into it right away, but first, please subscribe and like to this channel so we can continue having this channel grow. So, we've got, in this motion, it's a 24-page motion, and like a lot of filings, a lot of that attorneys file, a lot of it is not so relevant to what they're actually asking for. There's a lot of background, a lot of facts, a lot of things that have nothing to do with what she actually wants in this motion. So let's cut through all that and we'll just tell you exactly what she's looking for in this motion. But just like everything else in the Melly case, there's a few different moving parts and you got to remember, try to keep track of what exactly is important and what's going on over here. So we've heard that there's been some witness tampering or attempted witness tampering by Melly also. And there's been some reports about that. So what is the prosecutor going to do with that information? So number one, she can obviously charge Melly with witness tampering, but again, he's also facing much more serious charges than that. And we also have Cortland Henry, who's part of the mix. So Cortland Henry is also going to be charged he's going to have a trial also in this case because he's also being charged with the murder of the two individuals in the car. So you've got Melly who's in jail. Now the problem here is that Melly, not the problem, but the challenge for Melly is that Melly, his phone privileges were taken away because he wasn't exactly behaving apparently in the jail, and therefore they had to take away his phone privileges. So he's not actually even able to use the phone to try to tamper with anybody. So where do you get this idea that he has been tampering with witnesses? Where does that come from? Well, the answer to that is that in this motion, it details the elaborate scheme by Melly, supposedly, to communicate with the outside world. And he does that through involving other gang members and other people that are in jail, allegedly. This is all of what's included in this motion. And there's a whole system where he's passing notes to another inmate, and that inmate's passing the notes to somebody else and getting the message to who Melly wants to get those messages to. And then that person is actually going to make the phone calls and talk to the people on the outside. So we have an inmate named Terrence Mathis. You may have heard his name before about this witness tampering. So Terrence Mathis was making a number of different phone calls to a number of different people. One of the people that he was making phone calls to was Cortland Henry. Now we all remember Cortland Henry. So Cortland Henry is also out on bond. So why is Cortland Henry out of jail and Melly in jail? Well, Cortland Henry was able to get out. The judge granted his bond, and now he's able to be monitored in his home. He's basically on home arrest. He's only allowed to leave to go to church, things like that. So he's essentially on home arrest. But one of the conditions to the bond that Cortland Henry was given was that he is not allowed to have any contact at all with any witnesses that have to do with this murder, with these murders. So he's not allowed to talk to Melly, really. He's not allowed to talk to Mariah Hamilton. He's not allowed to talk to anybody that has any information, any witnesses that could potentially be called in this case. He's not to have any contact with them. So number one is that it's brought out in the motion that it seems that Cortland Henry actually admitted to having, in one of these phone calls, which are obviously all recorded when they're in jail, when they're made in jail, that Cortland Henry admitted to having some contact with Mariah Hamilton. So that's number one. But there's also some other suggestions that Terrence Mathis is making to Cortland Henry, which seems to be at the behest of Melly, to relay certain messages to Mariah Hamilton. Mariah Hamilton, we know, is Melly's ex-girlfriend, and allegedly he made a phone call or a FaceTime call to Mariah Hamilton from the scene around the time of the murders. So obviously Mariah Hamilton's testimony is very important in this case, and she is just nowhere to be found. They wanted to get her. They tried to schedule a deposition. They tried to get her to show up to trial, but she's just nowhere to be found. And in fact, the fact that she is absent was the basis of a different motion. This is back when Christine Bradley had the case, was the subject of a different motion that Christine Bradley filed, that since she's considered unavailable as a witness, other statements of hers should be deemed admissible. Generally speaking, you're not allowed to admit other statements. You got to get the best evidence. The best evidence would be the actual testimony of the person who you want to get information from. But if a witness is deemed unavailable, so then you can use other means to get their testimony in. So that was the subject of a different motion, which you didn't really cover in depth part of this trial. But because Mariah Hamilton now is, according to the prosecution's motion, being influenced and tampered with by this Terrence Mathis at the behest of Melly, she is kind of staying under the radar somehow. And there's been some codes that were being used in these conversations about what should she do. Should she? One of the things that Cortland Henry says, this is taken from the motion. Henry states, "Tell him Rihanna," which is referring to Mariah Hamilton, "already vibing in the Maybach. I don't know where he'd be getting his information, but just tell him to vibe though." So kind of him telling, don't worry, Mariah is in this Maybach, I guess code for she's hidden, she's good, she's not going to be doing anything, she's not going to be coming out, and she's not going to be testifying against you. Everything's good with Mariah. That's what the suggestion of the prosecution and their motion is saying by that statement that Cortland Henry made. So it seems that there is some sort of contact between Cortland Henry and Mariah Hamilton, which again would be against the order allowing him to go, for bond. And so that's Cortland Henry's problem. It's not really so much Melly's problem. But what's going to become Melly's problem is that if these suggestions that the prosecution is making, that Melly is trying to tamper with the witness, and now he's going to be charged with witness tampering. So now what's that going to do with his trial that has to do with the murder of these two individuals? Does one have to do with the other? Really, they're two completely separate charges. One charge is for witness tampering, okay, and then this other case, this other trial that is going to be retried in the process of the jury selection right now, that's a first-degree murder charge. That's a first-degree murder with the gang enhancement charge. So really, the two charges really have nothing to do with each other. And you would think that therefore they should be completely separate. And the jury hearing the murder trial, why should they have to hear about this jury tampering? What does that really have to do with whether he actually pulled the trigger or not? He may be doing something wrong after the fact, but what does that have to do with the actual murder? So that is really what the crux of this motion is about. The crux of this motion is that the prosecution wants to be able to bring out this information, the fact that Melly's been tampering or trying to tamper with Mariah Hamilton through this elaborate system of communication, of sending notes to different prisoners and inmates, gang members of his, in order to tamper with Mariah Hamilton. They want to be able to introduce that into the murder trial. Now, where does that come in? So there's some pretty strong basis in the law to be able to get this information into the first trial. Number one is get the charge for witness tampering included in this murder case. So you can have a case which is a first-degree murder case along with other charges. We know that a lot of times you have a number of different charges being tried in one trial. So number one is the first basis that they should be able to actually try this charge of witness tampering as part of the trial, so the jury can hear the information about this witness tampering. And even if they're not going to actually bring that charge as part of the trial, but just the fact that he was trying to tamper with witnesses, that evidence itself should be admissible into the murder trial. And the reason for this is that there's some pretty strong case law in Florida. And I'm going to quote for you some of these cases because it really spells it out very clearly in the case law. And this is a quote from one of the cases. "In most cases, crimes that are significantly linked fall within two categories." So crimes that are linked to each other are linked within there's two categories of how they are linked. Number one, those occurring during a crime spree, interrupted by no significant period of respite. So somebody that just goes on a murder spree, he just murders a bunch of different people, and at the same time he's speeding, and at the same time he crashes into people's property, and at the same time he's doing all of these illegal actions all within one crime spree. So that's how they are. That's how all these charges could be linked. That's one way. Number two is situations where even with a significant period of respite, which means that with situations where there's a big gap in time between the first action and the second action, the first crime and the second crime, one crime is casually related to the other. If a crime is somehow causally related to another crime, that is also considered to be linked. They're considered to be the same two crimes that are linked together. And if they're linked together, then they can be brought together. So that's one case. And then the next quote says the following: evidence that a suspected person in any manner endeavors to evade a threatened prosecution by an ex post facto indication of a desire to evade prosecution is admissible against the accused where the relevance of such evidence is based on consciousness of guilt. That's where that title came from this motion that the prosecutor filed. Consciousness of guilt is from this case. The case says it, that if such evidence is based on consciousness of guilt inferred from such actions, so then that is also admissible. So again, evidence, this is just to explain what we just said, evidence that if a person is trying to evade prosecution, even by an action that you take post facto, which is after the crime was committed or allegedly committed, and you take an action, but the point of the action was to evade prosecution, to get away from prosecution, to help your case, in i.e. witness tampering, get a witness not to testify, that is admissible because what is it evidence of? It's evidence of consciousness of guilt. There must be some sort of consciousness of guilt if you're trying to get witnesses not to testify. That shows us that you actually are nervous that that witness is going to testify, and that's consciousness of guilt. So that is admissible into this case, even though really the charge is something different than the actual murder charge. But since what you're doing, this witness tampering, since what you're doing shows that you must have a guilty conscience, it's consciousness of guilt, you obviously have a guilty conscience here, that's why you're doing it. So then evidence of that is also going to be admissible. So that is another. Then they bring some other cases which also, they go through some of these other cases, go through the facts of the cases and show how things are similar to our case. And here, what the prosecution has to foresee is that the defense can say, well, these cases are talking about actions that were actually taken by the accused. But here, Melly wasn't the one making the phone calls, right? It wasn't him, it was this other person, Terrence Mathis. So, maybe in that situation, if the situation was where the actual accused himself is the one making the phone calls, is the one taking this action, okay, maybe that's what these cases stand for. But what about in this case where it's so much further away from the actual conduct? Maybe that already, you cannot bring it. Maybe evidence of that is not admissible. So for this, they bring a very similar a case to what happened over here between jail calls, between an undercover detective and the defendant. And then they say the following: even where the defendant, and this is from a case, Morrell versus State, even where the defendant does not personally make the attempt to influence or intimidate a witness. So this is not, even if it's not Melly himself who is doing the intimidating or trying to influence a witness to either testify or what to testify or not to testify, which would be in this case. So this is what the case says: even if the defendant does not personally make the attempt to influence or intimidate a witness, an attempt by a third person to influence a witness not to testify or to testify falsely is relevant. So the fact that this other person, Terrence Mathis, was trying to get Mariah Hamilton or arranging with Cortland Henry that Mariah Hamilton should not be able to appear, that fact itself is relevant and may be introduced into evidence in a criminal prosecution on the issue of the defendant's guilt where it is established that the attempt was made with the authorization of the accused. If the authorization of the accused was, if it had, this third person had the authorization of the accused, so then it is admissible. So there you go, you have it, and it's pretty straightforward. They have this this case, and therefore the prosecution. This is the first move for Alexandra Bukalu, is to have that this evidence of Melly's attempting with all these notes and this elaborate communication in order to get the word out to Mariah Hamilton to not testify and to keep her away, so that should all be admissible into the trial. And now when they're trying Melly, they'll be able to say, look, he must be guilty. Why would he try to get Mariah Hamilton not to testify by doing this elaborate communication? So that's another argument now. If this motion gets granted, we haven't seen the defense's response yet, but if this motion gets granted, that's a strong, again, another strong point that the prosecution will be able to make, that he must be guilty. He has a guilty conscience. Otherwise, why would he be trying to get Mariah Hamilton not to testify? So that was this motion, and we'll see what the defense files the response. We'll see what they argue why it shouldn't be. Probably some of their arguments are going to be something like, it's such speculation about what those notes said and what he was telling Terrence Mathis to do. How do we know that Terrence Mathis wasn't just acting on his own? How do we know that Melly was the one that was orchestrating all of these communications? I don't know for sure. Maybe that's what the defense is going to argue back, and then eventually we'll have to see what the judge orders. But this is something that before the jury is even being sworn in, the prosecution wants the judge rule that this evidence should be admissible. So another twist and turn of the Melly case. And please, again, if you haven't yet, subscribe and like this video so we can continue having this channel grow. Thank you. That's it for now. We'll see you next time.